Welcome, everybody. This is a great turnout. That's awesome. My name is John Amble. I'm the editorial director at MWI. Most of you in here, I assume, know at least what MWI is. How many of you read MWI articles, listen to podcasts, or things like that? Great. So because of my job, I have the privilege of working on all of the articles that come in and everything we do. And one of the things that I appreciate most about it is the opportunity to learn about things that are going on in the world that are complicated and sometimes messy, and that you really struggle to get your head around. And the mechanisms that we use to do that, to try to make sense of them, are often at their best when they take sort of multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary perspectives. And that's sort of the purpose of why we hold these events occasionally, certainly why we're here today, to try to make sense of what I think everybody will agree is a pretty complicated and complex issue. So we have panelists from 4 different places around West Point. I'm going to introduce each of them, but first, we are here, and I suspect we have so many people here because there's a genuine interest in trying to, again, sort of make sense of what have been, to maybe use a bit of understatement, a busy couple of weeks. There's been a great deal of, I think, strategic uncertainty for those of us who have been in and around the Army for most of America's post-9/11 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think you might agree that while we've had a great deal of uncertainty during deployments to Iraq, it's been sort of tactical level uncertainty, maybe operational level, but the degree of strategic uncertainty that we're witnessing right now is something that certainly feels new to me, and I came into the Army in 2006, kind of just before the surge. So in order to try to make sense of that, we've got 4 guests here. Just to sort of recap, everybody, I assume, is kind of familiar with the big highlights of what has happened over the past few weeks, but a couple of weeks ago, there was an Iranian rocket strike on a US military facility in Kirkuk in northern Iraq, and it killed an American contractor. This is not something new. Anybody who spent time in Iraq has probably been on a base that's been hit by Iranian rockets before. But given the context, it was significant that this happened and that there was an American fatality involved. In response to that, 2 days later, American airstrike targeted Kataib Hezbollah, one of the Shia militias that is backed by Iran, that was held responsible for that rocket attack that killed the American contractor. 2 days after that, what happened at the U.S. Embassy? We saw demonstrations, large-scale demonstrations, things we hadn't seen before in the country that then turned violent. And a few days after that, we had the drone strike that killed Qassem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, the leader of Kataib Hezbollah, one of these Shia militias. Everybody, I think, saw earlier this week, Iran launched missiles from Iranian territory, which is on top of the previous round of escalation, yet further escalation. And then, of course, we saw something that I think everybody maybe kind of raised their eyebrows about, because we saw an airliner go down. And I'm guessing most people in here who saw that thought, that's kind of a coincidence. There's got to be something more to it. And yesterday, the U.S. government, along with several other governments, the UK, Canada, said they have intelligence that said that this was an Iranian shoot-down of that airliner, probably an accident. So there's all of this stuff that's really, really difficult to make sense of. And to help us make sense and to give us answers so that we all know exactly what happened, we've got 4 great guests here that I will introduce, and then they're each going to give kind of 5-6 minutes about kind of their perspective and their take on all of these issues. And then we'll get into Q&A and some conversation. So hopefully everybody here has is thinking of some great questions. So on the far end, we have Dr. Ruth Beitler, who is a professor of comparative politics in the social department. She also serves as the course director for Middle East politics and cultural and political anthropology. She's been a director since 2006 of the Conflict and Human Security Studies program. She's also the author of 4 books on a range of topics that I think are pretty relevant on terrorism in the Middle East and other issues. She earned a BA in Near Eastern Studies from Cornell and a Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy and PhD in International Relations and Middle East Politics from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Right here, kind of in the middle, we have Lieutenant Colonel Dan Maurer, who is probably first and foremost an MWI non-resident fellow. He also teaches constitutional law here at West Point. His research and writing relates to just war theory and jus ad bellum issues, civil-military relations, and the foundations of military justice. He's actually the author of a book on civil-military relationship theory and has written on the subject for a range of outlets, including MWI, Lawfare, and War on the Rocks. He's had a range of jobs as a lawyer, as a prosecutor, appellate counsel, chief of justice at Fort Sill, and chief of operational law at U.S. Army Africa. But before that, he started his Army career as an engineer officer and has spent time in Iraq in both capacities as a sapper platoon leader and then later as a brigade's senior legal advisor. Between the two of them, we have Miss Nakissa Jahanbani, who is an instructor and researcher at their Combating Terrorism Center. Her research focuses on Iran's proxy militias in Iraq and Syria, obviously of interest for this topic. And more broadly, it relates to how questions around state proxy relationships can be understood through various quantitative methods. She previously worked as a researcher at various human rights organizations and earned her master's in political science from the University of Albany and her bachelor's degree in international studies from American University. And finally, right next to me, we have Dr. Amir Irani-Tehrani, who is the Persian program director in DFL here. He left Iran in 1986, toward the end of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. After spending a year as a refugee in Germany, he settled with his family in California, where he studied political science and German at San Diego State University and later at Heidelberg University in Germany. He earned his PhD from NYU and has taught European studies in German and has also translated articles and books on the women's movement in Iran. In addition, he worked as an editor for an Iran-focused State Department website and is a linguist for the Open Source Center in Doha, Qatar. So with that, I think we'll get started with Dr. Beitler. If you could kind of talk a little bit, based on your background and your expertise, on the kind of the historical and strategic context of all of the stuff that we've been witnessing over the past couple of weeks.
Short request there. So,
yeah.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the context and the catalyst leading up to the attack on Soleimani. And then I'll talk a little bit about implications, positive and negative, and I'm going to do it all in 6 minutes. Okay, so good afternoon. I think the starting point for the catalyst in this discussion was May 2018 when the United States left the nuclear deal with Iran. So the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was signed in 2015 by the P5+1, so that's the US, the UK, France, China, Russia, and Germany. This was signed and we decided to leave in 2018. And the reasons that the administration gave for leaving the nuclear deal are the same critiques that were given for the nuclear deal when it was signed by scholars, politicians, practitioners, etc. And I'll put those into 3 baskets without getting into the weeds. The first one was that the JCPOA did not eliminate Iran's nuclear program completely. Some argued that it just kicked it down the road and that we were going to be threatened again by a nuclear Iran. The second set of critiques had to do with the fact that the deal didn't talk at all about proxies and Iran's support of terrorism. And the third critique had to do with that it didn't deal with Iran's ballistic missile program. It did talk about ballistic missiles in the context of their ability to carry nuclear warheads, but it didn't curtail Iran's ballistic missiles program. So for those reasons, we pulled out of the nuclear deal. So after that, the United States and this administration increased sanctions on Iran called the Maximum Pressure Campaign. And this is mostly on the oil industry in Iran, and they get most of their revenue from the oil industry. What is very interesting about the Maximum Pressure Campaign is it is actually harming Iran, devastating its economy very much. But I would be careful with the wording that I use here. I could not definitively say to you that the Maximum Pressure Campaign is working. By that, I would need to know what is it working towards. That leads us to the question, what is our strategy? I say our US. What is our strategy vis-a-vis Iran? Right now, that's fairly unclear. We hear the administration talk about regime change. We hear others talk about making Iran a normal nation among nations, not exporting the revolution, not seeking regional hegemony. So for me to say that the sanctions are working, I would need to know what they're working towards. But I would say that they are pretty devastating to the Iranian economy, as evidenced by the people out in the streets protesting. They are protesting the reduction of subsidies in the oil and the increase of the oil prices. But there is no doubt that they are also protesting, although they've been cracked down, they are also protesting the hardline cleric administration that exists in Iran. What followed most recently going on in that region have been the Iranian strikes on the American drone in June, the Iranian strikes on oil tankers in the Straits of Hormuz, also in June, and then the attacks on the Saudi oil fields in September. What's interesting about these three events, in June, after the downing of the American drone, the president, well, our president, President Trump, was ready to attack Iran in retaliation for that strike. He pulled back at the last minute. And from my assessment, I would say that not having military responses to these particular events emboldened Iran. Couple that with the very open speech of the president that we'd want to pull out of the Middle East, and it has definitely given Iran a reason to try to test what our actual red lines are in the region. Well, they pushed, and John spoke about some of those particular, what I would say are red lines. So in December, the attack on the Iraqi base, killing an American contractor, wounding American soldiers, definitely started leading to what our red line would be. And then, of course, the protests at the US Embassy, coupled with that destruction of the reception room, clearly was a red line. And the choice that the president made was what I would call the nuclear option. I think that hitting Soleimani was definitely the nuclear option. Not in the sense that it would change, and I will defer to Nakissa, who is more of an expert here than I am, but I would argue that they took out Soleimani in the Quds Force, but there is someone else to replace him. But the symbolism of the attack on Soleimani is huge. So very quickly on maybe a positive implication of the strike, and then I'll give you the negative implication of the strike. Maybe, and General Petraeus mentioned this as well, maybe now our striking Soleimani and having such a bold action may be a deterrent to Iran in its thought about where it's going to go next, its future actions. I will temper this and say I do not think that killing Soleimani is now going to lead them to not use their proxies. Hezbollah attacking Israel. They're not, Hezbollah, we could talk about the question and answer. They're not doing it yet. They're not looking for a war with Israel. But I think their proxies will still be active. So they'll continue with this asymmetric warfare. Given the Iranian response, and I don't think it's the conclusion of response, but the doomsday scenario that people talked about has not yet materialized, right? They responded, hit our bases, and people are trying now to de-escalate. But the negative implications, and I'll end with this, the strike has now deflected domestic problems in Iran. Protesters were out in the streets. It has unified the Iranian population against the United States. Now, it's not going to do that forever. They're going to be out on the streets again. But for now, it has done that. It has also done it in Iraq, because in Iraq, even the Shia population, the majority of them want Iran out of Iraq. And we see it in Lebanon as well, many anti-Iranian demonstrations. But this deflection of domestic discontent is somewhat problematic. I think, and I'll end with this strike, and this is, to me is very negative, has strengthened the Iranian resolve to get the United States out of that region. And that has lots of implications for ISIS reconstituting itself, et cetera. So I'll leave it there, and then I'll take any questions later.
Thank you. That's fantastic. You know, this is why I wanted to start with you, because I don't think we can make sense of, you know, the last 2 weeks without understanding this sort of recent historical context and the kind of strategic balance that and how that's sort of shifting over the past year, 2 years or so. There's also, though, a legal context, right? And so we're going to turn to Lieutenant Colonel Maurer to kind of describe some of the legal aspects that we probably don't often think about as much as we should.
Great. First of all, thanks to Colonel Howell and MWI for inviting Department of Law and the Lieber Institute for Law and Land Warfare to come participate in this really, really, really important discussion. You know, I would say I don't have any dazzling PowerPoint slides behind me to distract you, so I did bring one picture, though. When I think of the law, the legal implications, and the legal entanglements that we have that are undergirding this issue, I think of this. All right, this is a Gordian knot. And unlike Alexander, we don't have an easy legal sword to just cut the knot into and unravel everything. It's very, very complicated. I dare to say it's complex, not just complicated. So anyone who's had me in class knows that 6 to 7 minutes might feel like 60. So I will attempt to not do that to you. I would say that I have two pieces of evidence that indicate why and how complicated or complex this legal challenge is. The first piece of evidence is January 8th, 2020, 2 days ago. Congress passed a concurrent resolution basically saying, hey, Mr. President, we're not going to authorize you to use force anymore against Iran, whether it's from Iraq or in Iraq or outside. A concurrent resolution that is not a law because it doesn't go to the president for signature and possible veto, but certainly indicates a resolve of the legislative branch under Article 1 of the Constitution and is contrary to what the president has proffered. So that's one piece of evidence. Second piece of evidence is the fact that we see Iran reacting in a way to missile strikes that are based in part on arguments that we have historically condemned. Their legal justification has ranged from revenge, quite explicitly revenge and retaliation, to long-term deterrence. Now, revenge and retaliation is not a lawful justification for using armed force in any sense of the word, and deterrence has a very specific legal meaning. And by saying it's deterrent, it pushes the boundaries of what that definition is. The problem is we're using the same definition now. The definitions that we have criticized in the past, or at least held to be problematic, we seem to be using. And one of the concerns that I would raise is the fact that we've basically raised 4 different kinds of legal justifications, not all of which are consistent or persuasive in explaining what has happened. And they've done it not in a particularly formal and crystal clear way. So I'll get to that here in a second. So I would say that those 2 pieces of evidence really suggest to me that 2 primary legal concerns. Okay, one involves the blurring between what distinguishes non-international armed conflict from international armed conflict. So if you've had Law 403, you know what that distinction is, but basically it means state-on-state conflict, international armed conflict. State on non-state or civil war or something else is non-international armed conflict. The reason that matters is because the laws and the rules and the parameters and the restrictions and the constraints on the parties change depending on how you classify that conflict. So here you have this blurring, and it's important and it's negative. It's a negative blurring because it makes it more difficult to predict what our adversaries are going to do. When we can't distinguish between are we in an armed conflict with Iran right now? With Iraq? With Iran? I don't know. When you don't know that, it's hard to predict what the adversary is going to do because you don't know what rules of the game that they're playing because you don't know what game they're playing. The second thing is it makes it more difficult for us or our allies to scope what the lawful parameters of our use of force might be. And thirdly, it makes it more difficult for us to scope what protections and precautions we need to apply when we do use that force. So very difficult when you blur those lines. And I say it's blurred because of the following. When you look at the characteristics of the target, Soleimani, right? Who he was, what role he played with Iran, what role he played with regard to the Iraqi militia groups, what actions can be attributed to those militia groups or to Iraq, what actions can be attributed back to Iran, the location of the strike itself, and the underlying context of our legal relationship with Iraq and our legal relationship, such as it is, with Iran. So that gives me significant concern from an international law perspective. The second concern, or legal implication from all this, is more of a domestic issue. In my opinion, again, I can't speak for the Department of Law or the Lieber Institute or the JAG Corps. I should have disclaimed that from the very beginning. This is my own meandering thoughts here. It seems to undermine the strength of the War Powers Resolution of 1973. Okay, so we've had a long history of judicial deference to executive branch decision-making when it comes to national security issues and defense issues, long throughout our history. Really, it just simply asks, is there a rational basis for those kinds of actions, and it defers to the judgment of the military and the chief executive. But also we're seeing, over the last century or so, a congressional deference and acquiescence to how the president uses his foreign relations authority and commander-in-chief authority abroad. The one check on that came in the wake of Vietnam and the War Powers Resolution of 1973, where it attempts to impose some kinds of constraints. It's not an authorization, a standing authorization for using force by the president. It's instead a statement by Congress that says, Mr. President, we recognize that you can use your Article 2 power to put forces abroad and use it, but it comes with some limits. If you don't, you have to tell us why you're doing it. You have to explain the legal rationale for why you're doing it. And then if we don't authorize it again within 60 to 90 days, you have to withdraw those forces. So it's a mechanism to combine or to recognize really the shared war-making power between the two political branches. And again, the courts have traditionally stayed out of this discussion, kind of referring to it as a political question and non-judicial, which means the courts don't have a fair way of deciding who's right or who's wrong. So they leave it to the political branches to work it out. And we see how that goes. So when you have four different arguments, four different legal arguments, you cause some problems, right? So in my view, I think there are four arguments being made, some of which are persuasive, some of which are not necessarily persuasive. So in the last couple of days, we've heard a self-defense theory. Again, this is coming from various open source sources from our own government, whether it's a statement from Secretary Esper or Secretary Pompeo or a statement or a tweet from the president or a report from a congressman. There's a self-defense theory out there. Then there's a just deserts or retaliatory or revenge kind of theory going on. He deserved what he got because of all the bad things that he's been doing in Iraq and Iran over the last several years. All the horrible things that he's responsible for, he deserved what he got. Then there's the AUMF argument. So this is a more recent argument, and it seems to be being made, that the 2002 authorization for the use of military force by Congress that allowed us to go into Iraq and use force against the Saddam Hussein regime somehow supports this use of force in Iraq against a non-Iraqi. So that has its own problems, and most legal commentators that I've seen have vigorously said that is just not supportable by fact or by law, a straight plain reading of the AUMF. So, but that is an argument that apparently is being made to support it. And then the fourth one is deterrence. Again, similar to what Iran is claiming, right? The idea that we are preventing an attack, an imminent attack, that's self-defense, but we're also doing it to prevent further attacks downrange, both in time and space. Okay? Well, deterrence is not a valid legal justification. It makes perfect PR sense. It's a good political argument to make. It's a good social argument to make, but it's not a legal argument to make. So the problem, in my view, when you make all those different kinds of arguments and you're not terribly consistent with them, or you're not clear about them, or about the facts that support that argument, you lead to some concerns, right? You force the other political branch here, Congress, to be much more skeptical. And we cannot ignore, in my opinion, the underlying context of an ongoing impeachment inquiry in this affair, right? The relationship, antagonistic as it is between the president and between Congress, or at least some of Congress, is probably fueling a lot of the decision-making and rhetoric going back and forth with regard to the use of force in Iran. You know, if you had a president of one party and the same party that was in power in both houses of Congress, there's a lot more discretion and authority there. Here, not the same, totally different. So that is an underlying circumstance that we have to consider as fueling some of the discussion. And the fact that so far the legal argument has not been declassified. The statements that the secretaries made to Congress was held in a closed hearing. That's unusual. It's unusual, and it begs the question, what is the factual basis? And if you hear reports from the congressmen who participated in that hearing, it was unsatisfying. It didn't reveal anything significant or to justify it from a legal standpoint. So those are the concerns coming out of this. It relates back to, hey, Iran is going to react in a way that's going to mirror us. Their legal arguments now look like a lot of ours. And secondly, it re-engages, on a domestic sense, it re-engages the other branches to question and criticize and scrutinize the domestic legal arguments that we have. So pending your questions, I'll leave it there.
I suspect there will be some. I already have a few that I've written down. Thanks for that. We're going to kind of move on now, I think, Ms. Jahanbani, that one of the interesting dynamics is that this is a U.S. We're talking about U.S.-Iranian relations. This is a U.S.-Iranian conflict, but there's this other set of actors there, right? The proxies that enhance, amplify. They change kind of the Iran's capabilities in the region. In a very kind of interesting way, I think, in an important way, but a difficult way to understand. So I'm hoping you can, again, in 6 to 7 minutes, kind of explain that and make it all simple.
Absolutely. Thank you for, does this work? Okay. Thank you, MWI, for having CTC and me at this event. I'm thrilled to be here. I'll talk a little bit about the proxy networks and Iran's relationships with militias in Iraq and Syria primarily, because that's where the bulk of my research is, but that's not to say that the strikes haven't had implications for its proxies in Yemen or in Lebanon, and haven't been important there. So I'll talk a little bit about Soleimani's significance within the proxy networks, the status of the networks right before the strike, and then some potential implications for Iran's strategy in Iraq, Syria, and a little bit about the potential implications for the US military. So talking about Soleimani first, he was the commander of the Quds Force, which is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' extraterritorial missions arm. So they worked exclusively, on most occasions, outside of Iran. And so he was actually heavily favored by Khamenei, the supreme leader, and as such, he was one of the principal architects of Iran's regional strategy. A great deal of Iran's proxy networks in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon actually were due to his personal nurturing. There were a lot of pictures in the social media of these militias and also Iranian state media of him meeting with them, regularly having tea, hugging, and just this image of a very close relationship. And I think a lot of the health of the proxy network is actually going to depend on how much his successor, Ismail Qani, is going to be able to not just maintain, but then build on Soleimani's work. Some consider his successor to actually lack some of the refinement and gravitas that Soleimani had, but that doesn't mean that he won't be an effective leader. He has a great deal of operational background in the IRGC-QF in Central Asia and Africa, and has actually handled a lot of their financial disbursements to its parties. Looking a little bit at Iranian strategy in Iraq, ever since the US invasion in 2003, Iran had strategically not only backed the proxies, but also politicians in the Iraqi parliament to be able to maintain a friendly government in Baghdad and also put pressure on US forces. And presently, Iran backs a contingent of some of the most prolific, some of the most powerful militias that are part of the Popular Mobilization Forces, or the Hashd Shabi. Those forces are actually managed by the Popular Mobilization Commission, and the other person who died during those strikes, as you mentioned, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, he was critical to Iranian strategy in Iraq. He was actually largely referred to as Iran's man and Tehran's man in Baghdad, and for that reason, I think it's really important to consider his loss could be pretty important for how Iran goes forward with regards to its strategy in Iraq. That being said, despite the fact that, despite his loss, Iran still has partnerships with a number of other militia leaders in Iraq as well. So turning quickly to Syria, Iranian influence was probably impacted here, but probably not to the same extent as it was in Iraq. This is one of Iran's major strongholds. It's been ever since the Syrian civil war. It came in to bolster the Assad regime through supporting different Shia actors, and also to counter Saudi Arabian, US, and Israeli influences in Syria as a result of the conflict. Iran's influence in Syria was actually solidified in 2019 after the US forces withdrew, especially in the northeastern province. And part of Iran's strategy in Syria is actually to maintain a land bridge from Tehran all the way to the Mediterranean. So it's actually land and air, so from Tehran to Syria, and Syria all the way across to the Mediterranean. And through that strategy, that's how it's going to maintain and equip its proxies and influence and spread some influence throughout the region. Okay. Some interesting points about Iran, an interesting contrast between the two is that Iran's policy in Syria actually heavily weighed on Hezbollah's work. So Hezbollah actually acted like an intermediary in a number of instances. It would directly establish, maintain, train a lot of the militias that Iran actually works with to this day. So it might be interesting to see where that goes in the future. It might decide to take a step back altogether in Syria and continue to let Hezbollah do that, or even deploy Hezbollah more to Iraq to do something very similar to keep some distance between it and its militias. So I think one of the primary implications for Iraq is that Iran may not have the same permissive environment in which to operate because it has this additional American scrutiny and also a scrutiny from the Iraqi public. There's been a series of protests, right, where Iraqi people are asking for the removal of all external forces, Iran included. So I think that would be something important to keep in mind. The other thing is, in terms of for Syria, the Iranian-backed militias in Syria, and that includes both the ones that Iran and Hezbollah have established, but also Syrian branches of those Iraqi militias in the Hashd al-Shabi or the Popular Mobilization Forces will likely be able to better weather the fallout, and we might actually see a lot of Iranian posturing of power in the region through Syria and through those proxies. The relative weakness of the Assad regime and Syria's geographic proximity to Israel might also motivate that as well in an effort to project its influence. That being said, if Iran has to focus on consolidating power in Iraq, that may not happen. And then I think an important thing to consider is the ramifications for the U.S. military. So if the U.S. Military is focused on growing escalation from Iran, it could detract them from their fight, as Dr. Beitler mentioned, against the Islamic State. And there's already a little bit of evidence from that in the past week. And yeah, so those are my comments. I'm happy to talk a little bit more in the Q&A, but I just want to broadly cover it.
I will have questions for you too. So this is all sort of the context around which this is happening. But one of the other things that I think, if you're following the news, if you Google Iran right now, you're going to see a lot of stories that have pictures of lots of Iranians in the street. And that's sort of typical. When Iran features in U.S. media, it's because something's going on, and we just see pictures of Iranians in the street. We talked a lot about, in the early 2000s about the Arab street and how it would react to U.S. Interventions in Iraq and actions throughout the region. But I think we struggle to make sense of, if you could call it, the Persian street. We don't really know what the dynamics are, what the drivers are. We heard a little bit about, are they protesting the government? Are they protesting the United States? Are they commemorating Soleimani, like we've seen pictures in recent days? So I'm hoping Dr. Irani-Tehrani can help us make sense of that.
Okay. Thank you very much for your invitation, DMI. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history, and then we'll get to Qassem Soleimani. So about 40 years ago, Iran was a pro-Western monarchy. The king thought that Iran would run out of oil by the mid-80s. So he diversified a lot and invested a lot in Western companies, including American companies. After they took Americans hostage in the Iran hostage crisis, United States froze these assets. This was a lot of money. Now, for the next 40 years, Iranians went to, first of all, they executed all their military officers. Then they executed all their captains of industry, or they chased them out of the country. So they both got involved in a war that they shouldn't have been involved in, and their economy tanked. But they blamed all of that on America, saying America is keeping our money. If we had our money, we'd be okay. This narrative went on for a long time until the nuclear deal was signed, and then suddenly a lot of these assets were released. Now, Iran suddenly got a lot of money. The opposition, the regime change opposition, was not happy about this because they thought they're going to take this money and invest it in their economy and go like the Chinese model, where the economy is taken care of, but you don't worry about human rights or civil society, things like that. That's going to be quashed. Instead, Iran took this money and gave it to people like Qassem Soleimani to spread it around the region, fomenting wars. And the rest of it they gave to uptown Tehranis to upgrade their Lamborghinis and Maseratis. So that's where the money went. This wasn't noticed at first because the investments were coming in from Europeans, so people were hopeful. A government that came to power in 2013 called itself the hopeful government because the Europeans were coming to invest. When we pulled the plug on the deal, when the United States administration pulled the plug on the deal, then suddenly reality hit. The money was gone, and the poor that were the basis for the regime. The very people who had supported the overthrow of the Western monarchy, pro-Western monarchy, the poor people had received nothing in the past 40 years, apart from getting involved in wars, being maimed and killed, and so on. So in the past, since May 2018 till now, there's been sporadic uprisings in Iran. And these uprisings differ from the uprisings in the past 40 years because they're not by middle-class people asking for more freedoms or civil society or human rights and stuff like that. These are the very bottom of the barrel poor people asking for money, for bread. This is at the very basis of the system is hurting right now. Because of that, there's a crisis, and the crisis is this. For the past 40 years, we always have a supreme leader who calls the shots, and then for window dressing, they have presidential elections every 4 years where they elect a president, and they say, well, we have kind of a democracy. It does two things. First of all, for outside world, they can't call them a dictatorship straight up, and domestically, people think they are participating in something, while the shots are being called by the supreme leader. Now, for the first time, the supreme leader has a conundrum because nobody, not even the poor, is thinking about participating in these upcoming elections next summer. They don't know why they should. The winning card here would have been Qassem Soleimani because he's one person that everybody would have rallied around. Why? Because he hits two important marks. First is the Shiite connection. First of all, he had a 5th grade education. He was a bricklayer before the revolution. Then he joined the army, fought in the war, and became a general. So he's not like a sincere, educated general like they were before the revolution. But what he has is he can recite the Quran really well. He could recite the Quran really well. And he could hit these martyrdom narratives of Shiite Islam really well. And that gained him a lot of popularity among the troops. Another aspect that he has, this expansionist thing that he did in Syria, in Iraq, and Lebanon stuff, recalled to mind for other Iranians, for those who are not really religious or Islamic or whatever, the old Persian Empire. He was sort of hitting the Persian nationalistic nerve as well. So he had two things simultaneously going for him. Now, the supreme leader would have used this card, would have had them stand for election, so to get popularity for the election, except there was one issue. If he would have been elected, and he would have been elected if he stood for elections, the problem would be for the first time in 40 years, the president of Iran has more pull with the army than the supreme leader. So the office of the supreme leader would become secondary, would become a symbolic one. And that worried him. Us taking him out, Soleimani out for him, kind of short-term served him well, served the supreme leader well, because now he can play the martyrdom, narrative, which is very big and really deserves more time. Bringing people to the streets to mourn him, and that is a very big show that goes on for a long time, and kind of gets a lot of people really riled up, while avoiding having a strong president. So for now, he's okay, the supreme leader. This interest will die down, and by next summer, he has to think about something to do for his presidential election. But for now, what happened is the biggest wave of protests that they had after the nuclear deal was canceled was in November of 2019, just 2 months ago. Some sources say up to 1,500 people were shot on the street by sharpshooters, just picking people out from rooftops. That's brutal. They pulled the plug on the internet to do this. For 4 or 5 days, there was no internet. And a lot more were arrested and put in prison. That seemed really dangerous, and that has gone away now because everybody's now focused back on the whole death to America thing and martyrdom narrative, and that seems to have been forgotten. But it's going to come back probably. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you. That's fantastic. So we're going to open it up to questions, but since I'm the moderator, that carries with it the unofficial title of Keeper of the Microphone, which means that I get to ask questions first. So I'm going to, so if you've got questions, raise your hands. As soon as we get through kind of everybody here, we've got a couple cadets that are going to pass out microphones, although one of them is trying to sneak out right now. So I'm going to start with just sort of one question for each of you, if you could answer just kind of briefly. Dr. Beitler, I guess my question is, why now? You've talked about kind of the last 2 years of context. Why did December 2019 become the thing when things started to kind of spiral? Ms. Jahanbani, my question for you is, I've seen estimates of 120 to 150,000 members of the popular mobilization forces in Iraq that are loyal to Iran. By comparison, the United States has, I sent somewhere around 4,000 soldiers, a tiny fraction of the number of forces that Iran can sort of call on. My question is, how direct is the level of control that the Quds Force has over the tactical actions of those groups? Lieutenant Colonel Maurer, my question for you is, we talked about non-state actors, and the law of armed conflict is a difficult thing anyway. You kind of described the Gordian knot of questions. What are the unique enforcement challenges that arise when you're not just trying to enforce the law of armed conflict on a state, but on this sort of network of non-state actors specifically? And then finally, Dr. Irani-Tehrani, we published an article yesterday, and one of the points that was made was that in recent polling, Hassan Rouhani, the president of Iran's approval rating was somewhere around 40%, and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is at like 52%. The contention of this author was that there's a risk that this emboldens the hardliners who were saying, don't trust the U.S., they're not going to follow through on their commitments under the JCPOA anyway. What is the risk that in these upcoming elections, parliamentary and presidential over the next year and a half, will be sort of impacted along, with that dynamic sort of in mind? So Dr. Beitler, if we can start with you.
So as I mentioned in my opening comments, I think the why now has to do with hitting the red lines and creating perhaps a deterrent effect. I mean, how long could we, the United States, not respond to these aggressive activities? So the red lines were met. That's a why now. But the second, I think it's also a message to groups such as Daesh or ISIS, IS, that are sort of reconstituting themselves. That we are not, with all the discussion of us pulling out of the Middle East, that we are still a factor to be reckoned with. So I think it was a message throughout the Middle East and not just a message to Iran.
Okay.
That's a great question. Can you hear me? Okay, that's a great question. Thank you. So in terms of how direct the control of the IRGC-QF is over the groups, a caveat is all the information we have is observational, and in particular, the project that I'm working on at the CTC, which looks at roughly 60 militia groups over Iraq and Syria that have a direct connection to Iran. That's the universe I can speak to. That being said, I think it is considerably close control, mostly because Iran has had these proxies in Iraq for decades, ever since the Iran-Iraq War. It worked with the Badr Corps, it even established some then, and the progeny of those organizations, Iran continues to work with today. And for example, the Badr Corps, the Al-Muhandis's replacement is the commander of that, or the former commander of that, Hadi al-Amri. So I think it's important to bear that in mind, that this is not a recent phenomenon, and it's not as new as the one in Syria in many ways. For example, in the data that I've collected, I've seen that over the course of time, Iran almost like multiplies the amount of support that it can provide for multiple groups over time. So for example, for Harakat al-Nujaba, what it does is from 2013 to 2019, it provided training, monetary, weapons, intelligence, anything that the group needed to be able to be more effective, allegedly against the fight against ISIS, but it could have been in other contexts as well. And they also, there's a lot of accounts of the IRGC-QF and the militias attacking together, ISIS both in Iraq and Syria, so I think that's another indication of how close they might work together.
So your sense of the rocket strike in Kirkuk that killed the American contractor 2 weeks ago, and then the sort of chaotic scenes outside the embassy, was that they got a call from somebody in the Quds Force, in your opinion?
It's That's a very pointed question. I don't.
I've got more.
I don't want to. No, that's fantastic. Thank you. I don't want to say it definitively, but I don't think it's outside of the realm of possibility at all.
Okay.
So when you asked the question, I was reminded of, and the older people in the audience will probably recognize this allusion, but reminded of Chevy Chase in Saturday Night Live playing a president, being asked a very difficult question, and his response was, "I was told there'd be no math." So that's the mathematical problem in my view, meaning it's hard. Because it's hard to unpack what you mean by enforcement and what does a state do to enforce LOAC principles or LOAC compliance amongst other states other than doing it yourself and leading by example, which is one of the reasons we offer for doing it even though our enemies typically don't. I would say the simple answer, if there is a simple answer to this, is with non-state actors, is a blurring, kind of what I alluded to at the very beginning, blurring between jus ad bellum and jus in bello principles that guide law of war, right? So when you have a missile strike on a person like Soleimani, who is the most significant, most influential, and highest ranking military officer in another state, like the chief of the CIA, director of CIA combined with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs combined with a unified combatant commander, all in one person, who is overseas outside of his own country, operating with paramilitary forces and military militias of another sovereign nation with whom we are ostensibly allies. Is that an armed attack on another state? Us against Iran? Is it us against Iraq? Is it us against a terrorist? That distinction has meaning and it matters because it drives the rules and restrictions and regulations on what kinds of force we're allowed to use and when we're allowed to use force and the kinds of protections we must afford to the various people involved in that force. So by launching an attack against Iran, is that an act of war on our part? When they retaliated and launched missiles against us, is that further proof of an armed conflict between us and Iran? Or is this nothing more than the reality of him being an international terrorist, running an international or transnational terrorist organization and aiding militias who is detached and not under the effective control of the Iranian government? So the problem, again, with non-state actors is you need facts. And you need facts to understand what law is going to apply and then applying the law to the facts. Here, at least as of now, there is a dearth of relevant facts for us to kind of do a post-mortem on what happened. What was the intelligence leading up to the strike? How connected was he to Iranian Supreme Leader decision-making? How imminent was this a presumed attack against U.S. forces that we ostensibly prevented? Those are all facts that we don't yet have. So it's really difficult to determine where the lines are between appropriate use of force and inappropriate. When you're dealing with state-on-state actors, it's a lot more obvious, right? It's much more obvious to see when a state launches its forces and they're massing on the border and they're fueling up their jets and they're about to cross the airspace in another sovereign territory and invade. You know that's imminent, right? But what is imminent when we're talking about an actor like this, right? In my view, and I think many other views, you can't draw an analogy to previous strikes, right? This is a unique situation, a one-off, a novel event, because, again, of the relationship between Soleimani and the Iranian government, and Soleimani and the Iraqi militias, and his role over the last few years, right? So, I don't know. That's the difficulty here is we just, I don't know. It's tough for a lawyer to say that, frankly. So, I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
So the polling. Yes, absolutely. So the simple question is, next president, if there is a presidential election, is going to be a conservative president. It seems that way, for sure. About polling, though, it's very interesting because a cadet a couple days ago asked me, sir, I saw something online that Iranians were critical of Qassem Soleimani. I couldn't believe that. And is that true? And so the answer is sort of like if you went to the military academy in Tehran, somebody asked you, what do Americans think about Trump? What would your answer be? It's sort of like I mean, some like him, some dislike him for this reason, that reason, that reason. Those who like him for this and that, for those who don't like him. There's multiplicity of things going on. And then here we do polling, right? Because somebody calls you at home and says, hey, do you like President Trump? Do you not like her? And then you answer. But if somebody called me in Iran and said, hey, what do you think about the supreme leader? I want to say I'm in love with him or I love him a lot. Like those are you know. So the polling in Iran, that's the state of polling in Iran. But if you take that aside from what we've seen so far is, of course, there's going to be, because the reform movement the reform movement actually died in 2009 when the reformists elected someone and then someone else came out of the ballot box and they protested and they got shot in the street. That was the end of it. But then this nuclear thing came out and then they said, okay, so let's have a mixture of reform and conservative government, which is the government we have right now, which kind of saving the reform movement. And that didn't deliver either because people's lot is not better. So I don't think reformists are going to go to the poll. Therefore, yeah, I would say someone like Ahmadinejad, maybe not him, but someone like him would be elected. Yeah.
All right. So for most of you, this is the strategic context that surrounds the army that you're all, and some of you very soon are going to commission and is going to serve as officers in. So I assume that most of you have some great questions. So we've got one microphone here, another one I'm going to hand over here. Wait for the microphone if you've got questions until you get it, so that we can pick up the audio on the video.
Panel Cadet Panel, Cadet Edgar, Company F1. Dr. Beitler, this question is actually for you. In most recent news, it shows that the 20 missiles in retaliation against the United States forces in Iraq had all missed. Based on your opinion and your background, do you think that there is a strategy behind that? And do you think, what are the odds that 20 missiles hit 0 targets?
Thank you. That's a great question. One thing that is important to understand about Iranian strategy, they're more about protracting conflict at this point in time rather than escalating conflict. So I think it was part of their strategy. Maybe the base got a tip off. I mean, we have all kinds of intelligence, but I absolutely think that they were not looking to escalate, and it was a saving face mechanism to say, we retaliated, look, we used these great ballistic missiles. If there had been a loss of life, I am not quite sure what the US retaliation would have been. And one thing that Iran absolutely wants to avoid at this point in time is a direct war with the United States and a direct war at this time with Israel. So, I'm just throwing that in on another level of discussion. So, yes, great question.
Thank you, ma'am.
Captain Brent Bubany from Department of Foreign Languages. I have a 2-part question that I think many of you can address on the panel. And for the first part, I'll channel my best Corey Shockey, which I think you'll appreciate, Dr. Beitler. She had made a comment that the Iraqi parliament showed great maturity in asking for the withdrawal of all foreign influence and entities, not just the United States. And my question is, how realistic is it to expect that Iran would be compelled to withdraw after so many decades of presence and influence in Iraq specifically? My second question is, you guys, several of you mentioned or alluded to the ISIS presence rebuilding or restating itself, and how come not China or Russia as well? Because from my understanding, Qassem Soleimani was actually having his proxy militias fight against ISIS before the United States was combating ISIS. So we had a common ground in that case. Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
Great question. I can talk a little bit about the if Iran is compelled to withdraw. And I'm inclined to say no. It's been there for decades, and I think that through the militias, especially the ones in Iraq, it'll be able to maintain it. I think it just might look a little bit different. I mentioned a little bit about the scrutiny that it's under, both from the Iraqi public and government and from the American military. So it might mean that they might not be able to move as freely as they did. So Ghani might not be able to like come and visit the militia leaders as often as he did, as Soleimani did, for example. The point about China or Russia taking hold, I think that's an excellent point, particularly in Syria. Qassem Soleimani was actually the person who invited Russia. It's often said, I don't want to be definitive, that he was the person who suggested to the supreme leader we should invite Russia into Syria. And so if Iran is distracted there, if the United States is distracted there, it's a really excellent opportunity for Russia to take advantage of the Assad government and the power vacuum.
I would add one thing on the Russia piece, tangentially related. Russia it's a very complicated situation in Syria because Russia has relations with Israel. Israel wants Iran out of Syria. Russia doesn't want to be pulled in to, an air war, because they are really the only ones who could take down an aircraft for the most part, although an Israeli aircraft was taken down from Syria. So it's complicated. I think Russia also wants Iran to sort of back off on the Syria piece because it would like to have its stronghold in the region. So,
just real quick on the question of ISIS involvement or ISIS context. So, great question. So my understanding is that for a while now, well, really, the authorization that we have, the reason we have for being in Iraq right now is host nation consent. Right? Iraqi government has allowed us to remain in Iraq to fight ISIS on its soil and outside of its borders. Right? Their consent. So when they pull their consent, if it is legally binding and it does affect the government as a whole, that's a big deal. We don't have another authorization for use of military force right now to stay in Iraq. And we're certainly not at war in Iraq or against Iraq. However, the complicating factor here is the PMFs, the militias, the Iraqi militias, were fighting against ISIS, as you said, along with us as essentially a partner. In this strike on Soleimani, we killed the leader of that militia, who is, by the way, dual-hatted as a member of the Iraqi government. So, adds a little bit of complexity to the question now, are we at war with Iraq? I don't think so. I don't think anyone really thinks so. But consider the legal questions that rises. Are we still allied with these PMFs at all? Should we be? Probably not. I can't answer the strategic question, the wisdom question. I don't know what the future will hold. All I know is it just adds another layer of legal complexity to the question of, are we at war, one, and then two, if we are engaged in conflict, with whom, and then three, what are the legal parameters on how we use force, when, where, and against whom?
I'm not an expert in this at all, but I would just say this. The fact that we have a lawyer here talking is what differentiates us and them. They don't have this question, Iranians. They don't have a conundrum about what's the legal implications or something. The way they operate is not like a legalese operation, right? So maybe they officially say they're going to pull out, but I don't think. That is considered our backyard, Iran's backyard. So no, they're not going to go anywhere.
About here.
Cadet Den Knight, Company B4. I was actually going to ask you, sir, about Iraq and the implications with that, with them maybe asking us to leave. But as well, I know we didn't talk about it much. He mentioned at the beginning the recent airstrike on the plane, or whether it was a strike or a malfunction. It may be too early to tell, but do any of you have any thoughts on the implications of that? I know being Ukrainian aircraft makes it even more interesting. Is Russia potentially involved? What are your all's theories on that?
So, again, lawyers need facts. Generally, we don't like to make them up, although some lawyers are probably pretty good at that. I'm not. So I need facts to render some kind of legal opinion on something. And then again, whether anyone believes that, I don't know. But I would say I'd be hesitant to reflect on either the implications of the airstrike or of the strike on the aircraft, if it was in fact a strike, or what that means going forward and who might be involved or who's implicated. All I can say is we kind of put ourselves in this mess to some extent by not having sound clear. We might have a legal justification for doing what we did and what we're currently doing, like deploying troops to the area, putting boots on the ground, moving forces around, drone strikes. So we might very well have a plausible, legally defensible, domestic and international legal cause for that. We haven't articulated what that might be yet or why. And so that complicates things. So that induces maybe a protraction of the conflict, as you said. One could argue that it's escalatory, maybe. If those missiles had hit troops, maybe we would consider it escalatory and we would respond in kind or even with greater force. And then it just ratcheted it up, right? But now you've got the embassy threat, you've got the airstrike on the camp in Erbil, you've got the rocket attacks that missed the targets at Al-Assad, you have the drone strike on Soleimani. So it seems like you've got this escalating or back and forth, tit for tat between two powers, two state actors. And when you have that going on against the backdrop of not very clear or persuasive legal arguments on either side, and you have this confusing, ambiguous situation like, did a private civilian jetliner just get shot down? It just causes everybody to be that much more skeptical. Maybe it was just bad timing and it was a malfunction and just terrible luck. Maybe that's the case. But now we're having to ask those questions, and now we have to pull in all these other actors and ask all these other questions because we already started from this very, very uncertain, shaky ground, sandy, sinking sand starting point. So it makes it worse.
Got a question back here.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Cadet Amir Veto, Company F3, and you've touched on this a little bit so far, talked a little bit about the resolution passed by the Iraqi parliament calling for the withdrawal of all foreign troops. And I was just wondering if you could go a little further, assuming we do maintain our troop presence in Iraq, is this going to affect our cooperation against common threats, i.e. A resurgent ISIS or something like that? And then will this affect our relationship with any of our other partners in the region, i.e. the Gulf Arab states? Thank you.
I can start on that. So something that's very interesting, one, I just want to point out, that vote that was taken, we're really missing the Kurdish elements and the Sunni elements on the vote. So it was a vote taken without sort of the full weight of the Iraqi representation. But with that said, something that could very well happen, at least with the Americans, is that we might end up going up to the north to the Kurdish region, because even though the Kurds are under Iraqi sovereignty, it's a federal system, and in the Constitution, the Kurds have the right to conduct their own foreign relations. So what we might see happening is sort of a restructuring of where our American troops are in the region and what roles they play vis-a-vis the Iraqi government.
I have a follow-up to that. How do you think that would affect our relationship with Turkey?
Well, great question. So we already have a contentious, but we need you in some senses with Turkey. I think it will have the sort of the same impact that when we remove some of the troops from Syria, we're balancing with Turkey on both sort of the positive areas where we can work together and the negative. It will bother Turkey, but they know we already have been working with the Kurdish troops. So I don't think it'll make such an enormous difference.
Good one, kind of right in the middle.
Cadet Jack Farley, C3. I know it was mentioned multiple times about regime change, so I kind of have a two-part question about that. I was wondering if you think it's possible for the Iranians to have a regime change within their own country, and if not, should the United States attempt to influence a regime change within the country? Would that be beneficial for us in the long run, or would it just cause more problems?
Regime change. Anybody want to take it on?
No and no. No, I don't think regime change is possible because people like to live, and we're dealing with like a system that's not ashamed of killing people. It's sort of like you have you have the Indians uprising against the British system. You know, they kicked the British out. You have the civil rights movement, and in all of these movements, the bad guys were shamed into not stopping the killing. You know, these people are not going to be shamed into that. So it's sort of like no. That's one thing. And secondly, if America enters, then it's going to be even worse because then whatever happens is blamed on us. So I would say just knowing that.
I think an important component of that could affect potential regime change is the Basij militia.
The what?
The Basij.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Right.
oh, okay. Yes. So that's one thing that Qassem Soleimani could have done, right? Because he would be one person with enough connection with the government itself to change it. And this change is not really what you have in mind. It's a different change, but it's a change nevertheless. You know, changing from a theocratic system to a military dictatorship. That is possible.
In the back, yeah.
Cadet Michael Peoples, Company B1. Ma'am, you mentioned that they didn't really take into account Sunni and Kurdish opinions on this when they actually took a vote of some kind within the Iraqi parliament. Does anybody on the panel think that both this crisis and any recent events are going to further lead to the splintering of Iraq as a country into maybe 3 separate states, effectively, of the Sunnis in the west and the north, the Kurds also kind of the north, and then, of course, the primarily Iranian-dominated southeastern states, around Baghdad and the more Shiite-dominated areas?
That's a good question, and it's sort of an age-old question since 2003, right? Some people have been asking, will we now see the splintering? I don't think so. I think we see it. Right now it's a fragile to failed state. The Turks definitely don't want to see, even though Iraqi Kurdistan is fairly independent, I don't think they want to see a completely independent Kurdish state, which could lead to Kurds in Turkey wanting some of their own independence. A Sunni, splintering in a Sunni area, what would that look like? It would be sort of a rump state. Who would get the oil, right? Everyone sort of sharing this oil. So I'm not sure that will be a realistic solution here, or that it will happen.
I think actually, if you look at the news, the trend before this, a few weeks ago, was a more of a nationalistic feeling that was developing, yes. Right? People for the first time were not saying we're Shiite and we're Sunni. They were for the first time saying we're Iraqi, which is a very new thing for Iraq.
Why was that?
I think rallying against Iran for one thing, because they had figured out that Iran is not a nice ally, to have. I think, but everything is kind of changed suddenly because of this unexpected event. But the trend was a strengthening of a national force against Iran. Even Shiites were in on it, some of them. So, I don't know.
We have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions again.
Thank you all very much. Cadet Roberts, Company C3. Colonel Maurer, I had a question for you about some of the legal underpinnings for the strikes. There seems to be a growing sense and rhetoric out of Washington that the legality of these things doesn't really matter, and that as long as you have public support for it and you have at least a House of the Congress, that you can kind of do anything. We also saw President Trump threaten to target cultural sites. And so what is the state of the rule of law, and is it at risk?
That's a very, very insightful and very good question. Thank you. But I'm going to answer it and not answer it at the same time. How do you like that? I'm not going to render an opinion on whether or not the strike was lawful or unlawful, because again, I don't have enough facts. I haven't seen the intelligence to give you a good argument as to why it was or was not lawful under our interpretation of international law or domestic law. But I think you're right in observing that some of the statements by politicians, at least in the executive branch, politicians and political appointees, seem to suggest that it doesn't really matter what argument we make, as long as we make an argument or multiple arguments. And the beauty or the challenge of being the hegemon or thinking that you're the hegemon is that you can do what you want and not feel like you're going to face too many legal international consequences, right? We're not going to have President Trump or Secretary Esper or Secretary Pompeo dragged before International Criminal Court for their decision-making and actions. It's not going to happen, obviously. So what is the real consequence? I would have started off with saying, to make something lawful, a use of force lawful, it needs to have a domestic authority and an international authority. So just because you have international legal justification for using force doesn't mean a president can lawfully do it or Congress can lawfully do it. You have to have a separate domestic one. But having a domestic legal justification has bolstered many an administration on both parties to use force, regardless of whether there was a strong or a weak or persuasive international argument to the contrary, right? So there are some administrations that just simply don't care if there's an international legal justification for it at all. I'm not saying this administration takes that view. All I'm saying is that there is, I would agree with you, that there's evidence in the last couple of weeks or at least a couple of days, of members of the administration offering so many different ways to think about this without providing the data that makes it questionable. And if it's questionable, then we should rightly, as citizens, question whether or not there is a justification or whether our elected leaders care if there is one. So I would say, ultimately, it's difficult to enforce the rule of law when you don't seem to be caring about whether you follow the rules of the laws, right? When you don't seem to take those seriously, how can we project our own credibility abroad?
All right, we've got time for one question, one more here.
Panel, Cadet Williams, Company E4. I believe it was mentioned earlier that the resolve of the Iranians has been strengthened by this, but how does following the idea that the attack with the missiles was not an escalatory fact, but in fact just like, hey, we did something in response, how does that fit in with the idea that their resolve has been strengthened and not that they want an opposition to that instead of de-escalating?
So I'll go back to the protracting rather than escalating. I think there is a belief that they can definitely wait us out. We are not of the region. We haven't been involved in the region for a long time, but they have been there longer. And so I think there is this perception, and they were emboldened, their resolve was strengthened, and I think it's we can wait you out. It's a whole different mindset. This is not a they think like that. This is a different mindset than we have in the United States vis-a-vis our participation in Iraq. They know we have to leave sometime.
All right, well, as a trained military intelligence officer, I'm picking up on indicators and warnings that some cadets have to get out of here. So we're going to wrap it up, but please thank you to the panelists. Everybody give them a round of applause. And I'll see if hopefully they'll be able to stick around for a few minutes. If anybody else does have any questions, come on up and talk.